In the span of 48 hours, one quiet change in the plumbing of global money can do what 1,000 loud headlines never could. It can make the world question what it settles with. Not months, not weeks. 48 hours is enough for banks to reroute payments, for commodity traders to rewrite clauses, for a central bank desk to decide which asset is final when trust is the only collateral that matters, 7%. That is still dominant, still massive, still the center of gravity. But it is no longer the near unchallenged monopoly most people carry in their heads. They said this could never happen. They said there is no alternative. They said the world can complain about the dollar, but it will always come back to the dollar. Because the pipes, the contracts, the markets, and the habits are too deep to change. And yet, while most people debate personalities and politics, institutions are doing what institutions always do. They are building options, quietly, methodically, in parallel. If you're hearing about metal-backed settlements and BRICS experiments as if it's a fringe rumor, you are already late to the most important part of the story. The first move is never a headline. The first move is infrastructure. The first move is a corridor. The first move is a rulebook change that only a few desks read, but everyone eventually lives under. Institutions already know what they're trying to do. Most people don't. What I'm about to lay out is not a prediction. It's a pattern. It's the same pattern you can find in every major shift in monetary history. The signals show up in the boring places first: reserve composition, settlement rails, gold flows, collateral preferences. Then the repricing shows up all at once when the market realizes the world changed while it was watching something else. Welcome to the Macro Decode, where we track what the system is doing before it becomes a headline people argue about. If you've been looking for a place that connects the dots between central bank balance sheets, commodity markets, and the way money actually moves, you're in the right room. And if you like listening to that wise elder who speaks calmly while everyone else is shouting, you know what to do. Also, drop a comment with where you're watching from, because the way this story lands depends a lot on which side of the global map your economy sits on. Now, let's talk about what actually happened. The public version of the story sounds simple. A growing set of countries want to reduce dependency on the dollar. The private version is more precise. In mid-2024, a multi-central bank effort known as Project M-Bridge reached a minimum viable product stage. That matters because it's not a white paper anymore. It's a working settlement concept built with real institutions. At the same time, the conversation around BRICS shifted from speeches to mechanics. You started hearing phrases like local currency settlement, commodity-linked pricing, and alternative payment rails in contexts that used to be purely diplomatic. 3 tons of gold. That number was lower than the year before, but still far above the pre-2022 norm. The message is not that gold is trendy. The message is that gold is final. It settles without anyone else's signature. Here's where it gets interesting. While the world debates whether de-dollarization is real, foreign investors held about $9 trillion of marketable U.S. treasuries as of the first quarter of 2025, roughly 32% of what was outstanding. So the system is still dollar-heavy, still treasury-heavy, still deeply intertwined. And yet, at the same time, reserve composition is slowly diversifying, and gold's role has been climbing fast enough that by 2024, gold's market value share in global reserves could rival or surpass that of a major currency bloc. That is the contradiction. The world is still financed through dollar pipes, but it is slowly hardening its trust into things that do not require those pipes. And when settlement shifts, the first thing that breaks is not the currency, it's the assumptions. To understand why this matters, you have to look backward. In 1971, the United States ended the dollar's convertibility into gold for foreign governments. The immediate public story was political. The deeper story was settlement. The world went from a system where the dollar's promise was anchored to metal to a system where the dollar's promise was anchored to the credibility of U.S. institutions and the liquidity of U.S. markets. The result? The 1970s became a decade where inflation and commodity repricing forced everyone to learn, painfully, that money is a confidence instrument. In 1997, during the Asian financial crisis, countries learned a different lesson. If your external liabilities are in a currency you cannot print, settlement can become a trap. Result, over the following years, many Asian economies accumulated large reserves, built export-driven surpluses, and treated dollar liquidity as a strategic resource, not just a convenience. In 2008, the global financial crisis revealed that the world's dollar system is not just about the United States. It's about offshore dollar creation, dollar funding markets, and the plumbing that ties global banks together. Result, swap lines, emergency liquidity facilities, and a renewed understanding that when stress hits, the dollar's role becomes even more central, because it is the collateral language of the system. Now look at the present. In 2022 and after, sanctions, asset freezes, and the weaponization of financial access didn't create a new desire to diversify. They accelerated an old one. The pattern is consistent. A shock reveals a dependency. Institutions respond by building redundancy. They don't do it with speeches, they do it with pipes, with reserves, and with collateral. It's institutions versus single points of failure. Start with central banks. When a central bank buys gold, it is not making a fashion statement. It is choosing an asset that has no counterparty risk. It is choosing an asset that, in a crisis, can be pledged, swapped, or moved without asking permission from a foreign correspondent bank. 3 tons in 2025 is part of a multi-year pattern where official sector demand has remained historically elevated. Not because they expect a shiny future, but because they want an exit door that doesn't depend on someone else's policy mood. Then there are the payment and settlement bodies. A system like mBridge is not about getting rid of SWIFT overnight. It's about reducing reliance on the chain of correspondent banks that sit between 2 endpoints. Every extra intermediary is a point where settlement can be slowed, blocked, or priced against you. If you can settle directly, you change the negotiation. Now add commodity markets. Energy and industrial commodities are where currency preferences become real because these are the flows that must clear. If an importer can settle a cargo in a currency other than dollars, the need to source dollars changes. If a producer can accept a settlement asset with better stability or better geopolitical safety, the pricing power changes. The most important part is the contractual language that allows optionality. And then there are the banks and exchanges, often ignored because their moves are technical. But technical is where the leverage lives. Margin rules, collateral eligibility, vaulting practices, delivery mechanisms. These are the places where paper claims meet physical constraints. When a market tightens its collateral rules, it is telling you what it trusts. When a clearinghouse adjusts risk parameters, it is telling you what it fears. This is the part no one is discussing. If settlement begins to include metal-linked or commodity-linked mechanisms, the entire structure of dollars recycled into treasuries faces friction. Not collapse, friction. Now we get to the dislocation, the place where 2 data streams tell opposite stories. On one side, the official narrative of the dollar remains strong. The dollar is still the main invoicing currency. The treasury market is still the primary pool of liquid collateral. In stress, funding often runs toward dollars, not away. You can see it in every crisis flare-up. The dollar tightens and everyone scrambles for it. On the other side, the reserve data and the institutional behavior show diversification. 7% is not a collapse, but it is a trend. At the same time, gold accumulation is not a random trade. It is an institutional preference. And when gold's value, share, and reserves can rival or surpass a major currency block's share, that tells you something about the direction of trust. So how can both be true? Because the system can be dollar-centric in liquidity while simultaneously seeking non-dollar finality in settlement. Liquidity is about convenience and depth. Finality is about trust and sovereignty. Institutions can use dollars because the markets are deep, while preparing alternatives because the political and operational risks have changed. This gap cannot persist forever without consequences. Not because the dollar disappears, but because the price of dollar convenience rises when alternatives become usable. If you have only one road, tolls can be whatever the road owner wants. If you build a second road, even a smaller one, the bargaining power shifts. Let me show you the evidence in a way that snaps this into focus. 7%. 3% is not dollars. And the growth is not just in the obvious rivals, it's in other allocations that represent a slow search for diversification. This isn't a story of one challenger replacing the dollar. It's a story of fragmentation. 3 tons in 2025. To translate that into a feeling, that is a quantity of metal that cannot be conjured into existence by a keystroke. It must be mined, refined, moved, stored, insured, and verified. Every ton that moves into official hands is a ton that is less available to satisfy future demand at the margin. The market can absorb it until it can't. And the moment it can't, paper and physical pricing begin to diverge. Now connect that to treasuries, about $9 trillion held by foreign investors. That is the recycling mechanism. Trade surpluses get parked in treasuries, reserves get invested in treasuries. Dollar dominance is reinforced because surplus dollars go right back into the safest dollar asset. But if even a portion of those settlements begin to clear through alternative corridors, or if commodity trade begins to involve different settlement assets, the recycling loop weakens at the edge. Again, not collapse. Edge effects. And edge effects are where markets reprice because markets price the marginal buyer and seller, not the average. This is where the mechanism matters, how it is executed. Imagine the global dollar system as a giant highway network with one central fuel station. For decades, everyone has accepted that if you want to drive far, you refuel there. It's inconvenient for some, but the station is reliable, deep, and open most of the time. Now imagine a group of large freight companies quietly build their own fuel depots along alternate routes. They don't shut down the main station. They simply reduce their dependence on it. They negotiate better terms. They avoid bottlenecks. And when the main station has a disruption, They keep moving while others stall. That is what alternative settlement rails and metal-linked finality represent. It is redundancy. The execution happens in layers. First, bilateral agreements that allow local currency settlement. Second, regional payment systems that reduce the number of intermediaries. Third, experimentation with tokenized settlement or shared ledger infrastructure that can clear directly between central bank nodes. Fourth, the choice of collateral and reserve assets that make counterparties comfortable accepting those settlements. And then, the quietest layer, contract language. The world runs on contracts. If a contract says payment must be in dollars, you need dollars. If a contract says payment can be in a basket, or in a currency convertible into a commodity, or in a settlement token that is redeemable into a reserve asset, you have changed the game without changing the headline. Metal-backed settlement, in this context, does not mean everyone is walking around with gold coins. It means using metal as the trust anchor, as the thing that makes the settlement feel final. It can be as simple as using gold swaps to balance trade accounts, or as complex as building settlement units that reference metal prices and can be redeemed through institutions that hold the metal. Now, why does the market seem to underprice this? Because the transition is slow until it isn't. Markets are trained to react to events. They struggle with processes. A process can run for years with barely a ripple. Then suddenly the accumulation becomes visible through one stress event, a funding squeeze, a sanctions shock, a commodity disruption. And then everyone realizes that the infrastructure has been changing in the background. Historically, when you see reserve diversification plus elevated gold accumulation plus new settlement rails, you get three broad scenarios. In the conservative scenario, the dollar remains dominant, but dollar funding becomes periodically tighter. The cost of hedging rises. Cross-border liquidity becomes more expensive. The world keeps using dollars, but the privilege is priced more explicitly in spreads and volatility. In the moderate scenario, a meaningful slice of commodity trade begins to clear through non-dollar mechanisms, not because of ideology, but because of operational convenience and risk management. The recycling loop into treasuries slows at the margin. That doesn't crash the treasury market, but it changes the balance. Domestic buyers must absorb more, and prices adjust to attract them. In the aggressive scenario, a major shock forces a rapid shift in settlement preferences. Perhaps a severe sanctions escalation, perhaps a systemic banking stress that makes counterparties question correspondent access. In that world, the desire for final settlement assets spikes, and metal-linked mechanisms suddenly look less like a curiosity and more like a lifeline. Notice what all three scenarios share. They are not about the end of the dollar. They are about the repricing of certainty. So what should be watched? Specifically, if you want to know whether this process is accelerating, watch reserve composition updates for continued drift. Watch official sector gold demand for persistence, even if the annual number fluctuates. Watch the expansion of cross-border settlement pilots into production-like usage. Watch changes in commodity contract settlement terms. Watch the behavior of short-term dollar funding markets during stress, because the first sign of a system under strain is not a speech, it's a basis move, it's a swap line headline, it's a scramble for collateral. And watch the narrative gap. When institutions keep building alternatives, while the mainstream conversation insists nothing is changing, that is usually the period when positioning is easiest and complacency is highest. That brings us to the divide. The difference between those who understand this and those who don't is not intelligence. It's attention. Most people stare at price charts and news cycles. Institutions stare at settlement, collateral, and policy architecture. The information gap becomes a wealth gap because the first move is always made in the boring layer. Retail tends to move after the story becomes emotional. Institutions move before the story becomes visible. And this is why the dollar problem nobody is pricing in is not a single dramatic collapse. It is the slow shift of leverage. It is the quiet loss of monopoly pricing power. It is the emergence of alternatives that make the dollar one option among several in specific corridors, specific commodities, specific counterparties. When a system loses monopoly status, it doesn't vanish. It competes. And competition has a price. So if you take one thing from this, take this. Metal-backed settlement talk is not about nostalgia. It is about trust. It is about finality. It is about what institutions choose when they want a claim that cannot be frozen, canceled, or diluted by someone else's policy. There's another layer that makes this feel quiet, even as it is consequential. Most of the world's monetary power is exercised through standards, not announcements. A standard is the invisible rule that decides what counts as money-like, what qualifies as high-quality collateral, what can be posted at a clearinghouse, what can be accepted by a central bank in an emergency window. When that standard changes, the market doesn't ring a bell. It simply resorts what it values. That's why the discussion around BRICS and settlement can't be reduced to slogans. Within BRICS, the countries are not identical. They have different inflation histories, different capital controls, different external balances, and different domestic political constraints. A single shared currency would be complicated. A single shared settlement unit, however, is a different proposition. Settlement does not require full monetary union. Settlement requires agreement on what extinguishes a debt between counterparties at the end of the day. And metal is an ancient answer to that question, not because it is magical, but because it is globally legible. If a counterparty says, this claim is convertible into a quantified amount of a widely recognized commodity, you have created a bridge of trust that doesn't require you to fully trust the counterparty's domestic policy over decades. You only need to trust the convertibility mechanism and the custody. Now, look at why the dollar remains so powerful. The dollar is not just a currency. It is an ecosystem. Deep treasury collateral, enormous repo markets, derivatives clearing, global correspondent banking, and a legal structure that most counterparties still trust more than alternatives. That ecosystem creates network effects. The more people use it, the more liquid it becomes, and the more liquid it becomes, the more people use it. But network effects can be chipped away at the margins. And the margins matter because global trade is not one uniform river. It is a set of channels, a corridor between two specific regions, a commodity chain between a producer and a consumer, a strategic import that cannot be interrupted. If even a few of those channels begin settling with different tools, the system becomes more multipolar in practice, even if it remains dollar-heavy in aggregate statistics. This is why the pricing in problem is so persistent. Markets tend to treat reserve share drift as a slow-moving macro fact, not a catalyst. They treat gold buying as a curiosity. They treat settlement pilots as tech experiments. They treat bilateral trade agreements as politics. But when you stack them together, you get a single picture. Preparation for a world where access to the dollar system is not assumed and where final settlement must be possible, even under friction. And that brings us back to time compression. The day the market notices is not the day the pipes are built. It is the day a large payment fails to clear on time, or clears on an alternative rail and doesn't come back. It is the day a commodity flow is settled with a different unit and counterparties copy it. It is the day funding stress forces desks to pay up for collateral in a way that makes the old assumptions look expensive. It shows up as a spread, a basis, a widening between what is promised on paper and what is demanded in reality. It shows up in volatility that refuses to die. It shows up in a higher premium for safety and a higher penalty for dependency. So the story is not that BRICS will flip a switch and dethrone the dollar. The story is that the dollar's convenience has been underwritten by a lack of alternatives. As alternatives become usable in specific contexts, convenience becomes a service, and services get priced. The dollar can remain central and still become more expensive to rely on. That is the quiet move. That is the metal-backed logic. And that is the problem most people are not pricing in because it doesn't arrive with fireworks. It arrives with paperwork, with settlement instructions, and with a steady accumulation of assets that don't require anyone's permission. This is the macro decode, where we connect what matters before it becomes tomorrow's argument. If this helped you see the plumbing behind the headlines, you already know what to do. And the real question isn't whether this process continues. The question is whether you'll recognize the shift while it's still happening quietly, or only after the market forces everyone to price it in.